For 300 cycles, Station Aethelgard was the definition of perfection. Every bolt was tightened to the exact micromillimeter, and every floor was clean enough to eat off of. Overseer Xylar believed that safety came from following the rules. But he was about to learn a terrifying lesson: the universe does not care about rules. When the main power died and the alarm started screaming, the sophisticated alien technology turned into useless junk. The crew prepared to die. But they had forgotten about the new maintenance team. 2 humans were about to prove that you don't need a degree in quantum physics to fix a spaceship. Sometimes, all you need is a hammer, a little bit of madness, and a lot of duct tape. Overseer Xylar stood in the center of the main docking bay of Station Aethelgard. He checked his digital tablet for the 10th time that morning. Every light on the board was green. Every system was running at perfect efficiency. The floor was so clean that Xylar could see his own purple face reflected in the white tiles. This was how a space station should be. It was quiet, organized, and completely safe. Xylar was very proud of his station. He had not had a single safety accident in 100 cycles. But today, his perfect record was in danger. Today, the humans were coming. The docking clamps engaged with a loud metallic groan that echoed through the silent hull. This was the first sign of trouble. Usually, docking was a silent and smooth process. The human ship, the Rusty Bucket, did not look like a Galactic Union vessel. It looked like several metal boxes welded together by a madman. The airlock hissed open, releasing a cloud of steam that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. Xylar straightened his pristine white uniform and prepared to greet the new maintenance engineers. He expected them to be like the other alien mechanics, tall, elegant, and holding delicate laser scanners. He was very wrong. 2 figures walked out of the steam. They were short and stocky. They wore heavy blue jumpsuits that looked like they had been used to wipe up an oil spill. Dark stains covered their knees and elbows. They did not carry laser scanners or digital pads. Instead, they dragged heavy metal boxes on wheels behind them. The wheels squeaked loudly against the polished floor. Squeak. Clunk. Squeak. Clunk. The sound was painful to Xylar's sensitive ears. The human male, who had a name tag that read Dave, stopped in front of Xylar. He wiped a dirty hand on his pants and offered it to the overseer. Xylar stared at the hand with horror but nodded politely. The human female, Sarah, was already looking at the ceiling tiles with a suspicious frown. She chewed on a piece of gum, a habit that was strictly forbidden in the sterile zone. Xylar cleared his throat nervously. He had to establish control immediately. He picked up a heavy data crystal from a cart. This crystal contained the station maintenance protocol. It was 4,000 pages long. It explained how to hold a screwdriver correctly and the proper mathematical angle for turning a bolt. It was the most important book on the station. Xylar explained that they must memorize the first 500 pages before touching any machinery. He spoke about safety, precision, and the delicate nature of the station's gravity drive. Dave took the crystal. He looked at it for 1 second. He weighed it in his hand. Then, with a casual shrug, he tossed the crystal onto a nearby table. It landed with a loud crash. Xylar almost fainted. Dave laughed and said they didn't need manuals. He said they had instincts. Sarah dropped her heavy toolbox onto the floor. It sounded like a bomb going off. She opened it, revealing a mess of primitive tools. There were iron hammers, jagged saws, and metal wrenches. There were no computers or diagnostic tools. But right on top sat the most terrifying item of all. It was a roll of sticky silver fabric. Dave picked it up and held it like a holy artifact. He called it duct tape. He told Xylar that this roll could fix a cracked hull or a broken heart. Xylar looked at the dirty humans, their primitive tools, and the silver tape. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The nightmare had officially begun. 3 days into the human exchange program, Station Aethelgard faced its first crisis. It happened in the busiest hallway of the ship, right between the sleeping quarters and the cafeteria. The blast door, a masterpiece of magnetic engineering, refused to open. Usually, these doors glided silently like ghosts. They were designed to sense a person walking toward them and open before the person even realized they were there. But today, door 42 had a mind of its own. It slid halfway open, made a terrible grinding noise, and then froze. It blocked the entire path. Hundreds of hungry aliens stood on one side, unable to get to their breakfast. It was a disaster. Overseer Xylar arrived at the scene with a team of elite alien scientists. They were the best minds on the station. They wore long silver robes and carried holographic scanners that hummed with blue light. Xylar was sweating. A stuck door was a sign of chaos, and Xylar hated chaos. The lead scientist, a tall being with large black eyes, scanned the door for 10 minutes. He looked very serious. He turned to Xylar and explained the problem. He said the door's quantum magnetic sensors were out of alignment by 0.004%. To fix it, they would need to shut down the power to the entire sector for 3 days. They would have to take the door apart, piece by piece, and rebuild it using a laser microscope. Xylar felt dizzy. 3 days without the main hallway. The crew would riot. The scientists set up orange energy barriers to keep people away. They began to set up complex computers to calculate the math required to fix the door. It was a very serious and delicate operation. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone spoke in whispers. They treated the stuck door like a bomb that might explode at any moment. Then, the humans arrived. Dave and Sarah were walking toward the cafeteria, hoping to get coffee. They saw the crowd of aliens and the orange barriers. They saw the scientists looking at charts and graphs. Dave was holding a half-eaten donut, and Sarah was wiping grease off a large wrench. They did not look like scientists. They looked like they had just wrestled a machine and won. They walked right through the orange barrier. Xylar tried to stop them. He waved his hands frantically. He told them that the situation was critical and required advanced calculations. He warned them that the magnetic field was unstable. Sarah ignored him completely. She walked up to the stuck door. She did not take out a scanner. She did not look at the schematics. Instead, she leaned her head against the metal panel. She closed her eyes and listened. The aliens went silent. They watched her with wide eyes, wondering what kind of mystical human sensor she was using. Sarah listened to the motor humming inside the wall. She heard a small click-click buzz sound. She nodded to herself. It wasn't a quantum error. It was just a piece of grit stuck in the gear. She took a step back. She looked at the bottom left corner of the door panel. She adjusted her heavy work boot. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, she kicked the door. Clang! The sound rang through the hallway like a gunshot. Xylar screamed. The scientists dropped their scanners. They were sure she had destroyed the delicate mechanism. Violence was never the answer to engineering problems in the Galactic Union. But then, something amazing happened. The grinding noise stopped. The motor hummed smoothly. With a polite whoosh, the door slid all the way open. The green light turned on. The path was clear. The aliens stared at the open door, then at Sarah. They were completely confused. They looked at their computers, trying to find the mathematical formula for the kick. They assumed she had calculated the exact kinetic force needed to realign the atoms. Sarah didn't explain. She just walked through the open door, followed by Dave, who gave Xylar a thumbs up. Xylar stood alone in the hallway, looking at the door, realizing that everything he knew about engineering was wrong. The hydroponics bay was the most beautiful room on Station Aethelgard. It was a large glass dome filled with rare purple plants and floating flowers from a dozen different planets. The air always smelled like sweet perfume and rain. It was a place of total peace, usually. But on this Tuesday morning, the peace was shattered by a sound that every spacer fears. It started as a high-pitched whistle, followed by a loud crack, and then the roaring sound of rushing water. A main nutrient pipe, hidden behind a wall of ferns, had burst open. A thick jet of green water sprayed across the room with the force of a fire hose. Overseer Xylar ran into the room, slipping on the wet floor. His purple face turned pale with terror. This was not just a gardening problem. The hydroponics bay was located directly above the main server room. The water was already pooling on the floor and seeping into the cracks. If that water dripped down into the supercomputers below, the station's artificial intelligence would short-circuit. The life support, the gravity, and the navigation would all fail instantly. The station would be dead in space. The alarm system flashed red lights, screaming, critical moisture levels. The alien maintenance crew stood around the broken pipe, looking hopeless. They were holding digital tablets and checking the station's inventory. The head plumber, a creature with 4 arms, reported the bad news to Xylar. The broken pipe was a Class 4 high-pressure conduit. The replacement part had to be made of a specific crystal alloy. They checked the warehouse, but the shelf was empty. The computer said a new pipe could be shipped from the homeworld in 14 standard days. The head plumber explained that they had no choice. They could not fix it. They had to evacuate the lower levels and let the servers flood. It was the only logical conclusion according to the manual. Dave and Sarah jogged into the bay. They were eating sandwiches. They saw the chaos. They saw the aliens preparing to abandon the ship. Dave looked at the pipe spraying green water everywhere. He did not check a tablet. He did not ask about alloy compositions or shipping times. He simply threw his sandwich on a dry bench and waded into the flood. The water soaked his boots and his heavy blue jumpsuit, but he didn't care. He walked right up to the spraying pipe to inspect the damage. The pressure was strong enough to bruise a hand, but Dave just squinted at it. He looked around the room for something to use. His eyes landed on an old, discarded rubber boot that belonged to a gardening robot. It was dirty and torn. Xylar watched in confusion as Dave grabbed the boot and pulled out a pocket knife. With one quick motion, Dave sliced a large square of thick rubber from the boot. He slapped the rubber patch over the hole in the pipe. Water sprayed into his face, but he pushed hard, using his body weight to hold the rubber in place against the high pressure. He yelled to Sarah to pass the magic. Sarah reached into her belt and pulled out the large roll of silver duct tape. She tossed it to Dave. Xylar gasped. He wanted to scream that sticky tape could not hold back 50 bars of hydraulic pressure. It was scientifically impossible. But Dave did not stop for science. He began to wrap. He wrapped the tape around the rubber patch. Then he wrapped it again. And again. He went around the pipe 50 times. He used almost the entire roll. The sound of the tape ripping off the roll echoed through the silent room. Finally, Dave stepped back. He was dripping wet and covered in green slime. The pipe looked terrible. It looked like a giant, shiny silver ball had swallowed the leak. It was lumpy and ugly. It was an insult to the elegant architecture of the station. But there was no spraying sound. There was no dripping. The room was silent. Xylar stared at the monstrosity. He waited for it to explode. He waited for the water to burst through. But the silver lump held firm. The readout on the wall changed from critical to stable. Dave wiped his hands on his pants, picked up his sandwich, and told Xylar that the temporary fix would probably last for 10 years. Xylar looked at the rubber boot scrap and the tape, and he felt a headache coming on. The catastrophe arrived without any warning. One moment, Station Aethelgard was orbiting peacefully, and the next, the entire universe seemed to turn white. A massive solar flare, a wave of pure energy from the nearby star, slammed into the station's shields. The impact was like a giant hammer hitting a bell. The station shuddered violently, throwing aliens out of their chairs and sending data pads flying across the room. Then, the darkness came. The main reactor, sensing the dangerous surge of energy, performed an emergency shutdown to save itself. The lights died. The hum of the ventilation stopped. Worst of all, the artificial gravity generator spun down into silence. Overseer Xylar found himself floating near the ceiling of the command center. The emergency red lights flickered on, casting long, scary shadows across the room. He kicked his legs helplessly, trying to grab a handle. The silence was heavy and terrifying. Then, the backup computer spoke with a dying voice. It reported that the solar flare had fried the external power coupling. The main fuse, a device the size of a car located on the outer hull of the ship, had blown out. Without that fuse, the backup generators could not connect to the station. They had 40 minutes of oxygen left in the pipes. After that, the air would turn stale, and everyone would go to sleep forever. The bridge crew panicked. They were excellent mathematicians and navigators, but they were not warriors. They typed frantically on their dead consoles. Xylar managed to pull himself down to the communications desk. He knew the protocol for this. They needed to send a repair bot outside to replace the fuse. But the report showed that all the repair bots had been deactivated by the magnetic pulse. The only other option was a manual repair by a living being. Xylar looked at the airlock status. The high-tech, computerized lockers that held the heavy EVA spacesuits were frozen shut. They required power to open, and there was no power. It was a cruel irony. They were trapped inside their own safety measures. Dave and Sarah floated into the command center. They looked like they were swimming through the air. They did not look scared. They looked annoyed, mostly because the gravity failure had spilled Dave's coffee. They heard the computer's warning about the oxygen. Dave looked at the sealed suit lockers. He tried to pry one open with a crowbar, but the locking bolts were made of hardened steel. Xylar told them it was hopeless. He explained that without a Class A pressure suit, the vacuum of space would boil their blood in seconds. He told them to make peace with the universe. Sarah ignored Xylar's philosophy. She floated over to a shipping pallet in the corner of the room. It was covered in rolls of industrial-strength plastic shrink wrap, the kind used to secure heavy cargo boxes. She looked at Dave, and a silent understanding passed between them. Dave nodded and pulled 2 large fire extinguishers from the wall. He checked the pressure gauges. They were full. The humans had a plan, and it was the most insane thing Xylar had ever witnessed. They were not going to give up. They were going to go outside, but not in spacesuits. They began to wrap each other. Dave held his arms out while Sarah spun around him with the roll of plastic wrap. She covered his grease-stained jumpsuit in layer after layer of the clear plastic. She wrapped his legs, his torso, and his arms until he looked like a shiny, plastic mummy. Then, she used the silver duct tape to seal every seam and joint. They found 2 emergency oxygen masks and taped them to their faces. For helmets, they used clear plastic storage buckets, sealing them to the neck of their suits with even more tape. It was ugly. It was primitive. It looked like a child's costume made of garbage. Xylar watched in horror as they floated toward the manual maintenance airlock, which could be opened with a hand crank. They looked ridiculous. They carried the fire extinguishers to use as crude jetpacks to fly through the void. Xylar wanted to stop them. He wanted to cite the safety regulations regarding unauthorized spacewalks and improper attire. But he couldn't speak. He could only watch as the humans entered the airlock, ready to face the deadly vacuum of space wrapped in nothing but plastic sheeting and determination. The outer airlock door opened with a vibration that could be felt through the floor, even without air to carry the sound. The vast, Infinite blackness of space stretched out before them. Usually, leaving the station required hours of preparation, safety checks, and a suit that cost more than a small planet. Dave and Sarah stepped out wearing plastic wrap and duct tape. To the terrified aliens watching on the bridge monitors, the humans looked like leftovers that had been wrapped up for the refrigerator. The makeshift suits crinkled and puffed out as the pressure difference hit them, but the layers of tape held firm. The plastic buckets on their heads fogged up slightly with their breath, but they didn't crack. Movement in zero gravity without a propulsion pack is impossible, or at least, it should be. But Dave and Sarah had the fire extinguishers. Dave aimed the nozzle of his red tank away from the station and squeezed the handle. A white cloud of chemical foam shot out silently into the void. Newton's third law of motion took over immediately. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The force of the spraying foam pushed Dave backward, launching him toward the blown fuse box on the hull. He flailed his arms wildly, spinning in a slow circle like a chaotic dancer, but he was moving. Sarah followed him, firing her extinguisher in short bursts to steer herself. It was the ugliest, clumsiest flight in the history of space travel. Inside the station, Overseer Xylar watched the view screen through his fingers. He was shaking. He expected the plastic to rip. He expected the humans to freeze or explode. The medical officer was already preparing death certificates. The navigation officer was calculating the trajectory of their frozen bodies. But the humans kept moving. They bounced off the hull, grabbed onto antenna poles, and pulled themselves hand over hand toward the repair site. They looked like clumsy children playing in a swimming pool, yet they were moving faster than any safety-compliant repair bot ever could. They reached the main power junction. The damage was worse than the sensors had reported. The massive fuse box was a blackened ruin. The copper connectors had melted into useless lumps of slag. The fuse itself was gone, vaporized by the solar flare. Dave wiped the fog from his bucket helmet and waved his arms at Sarah. They had no spare fuse. Even if they had brought one, it wouldn't fit into the melted slot. Xylar saw them hesitate. He slumped in his floating chair. This was it. They had made the journey for nothing. The station was doomed. But Sarah did not look defeated. She looked determined. She reached into her plastic-wrapped belt and pulled out her favorite tool, the heavy, iron pipe wrench. It was a primitive tool, heavy and crude, used for hitting things until they worked. She tapped Dave on the shoulder and pointed to the two main power cables that were disconnected. The gap between them was about 10 inches. The wrench was 12 inches long. Dave understood immediately. He gave her a thumbs up. Sarah floated into position. She braced her boots against the scorched metal of the hull. She held the wrench with both hands. Slowly, carefully, she lowered the metal tool toward the live cables. Inside the station, the bridge crew gasped. She was going to use the wrench to bridge the circuit. If she touched the wrong part, the electricity would fry her instantly. If the connection wasn't solid, the arc would melt the wrench. It was madness. It was suicide. It was engineering. She jammed the wrench into the gap. Flash. A blinding spark of blue light erupted from the fuse box, visible even from the bridge. The wrench welded itself to the contacts instantly, completing the circuit. The electricity flowed through the solid iron handle, bypassing the melted fuse entirely. Inside the station, the lights flickered once, twice, and then blazed to life. The hum of the gravity generator returned, dropping Xylar and his crew to the floor with a heavy thud. The air vents began to hiss with fresh oxygen. On the screen, Dave and Sarah were drifting away from the hull, pushed back by the force of the spark. Their plastic suits were scorched and black, but they were giving each other a high five in the silence of space. The wrench glowed red hot, stuck firmly in the side of the ship, holding the entire station's power grid together. Xylar lay on the floor, breathing the fresh air, and realized that the most advanced space station in the galaxy was now being powered by a piece of plumbing equipment. 2 weeks after the solar flare, the dreaded day arrived. A massive black ship docked at Station Aethelgard. It belonged to the High Inspector of the Galactic Union. This was not a friendly visit. The High Inspector was known for closing down stations that did not meet the perfect standards of the Union. Overseer Xylar stood by the airlock, his uniform pressed and cleaned, but his hands were shaking. He knew what the inspector would find. The station was alive, but it was no longer pristine. It was covered in human repairs. There was the dented door, the taped-up pipe, and the wrench welded to the outer hull. Xylar felt sure that his career was over. He expected to be fired and sent to work in the spice mines. The High Inspector walked onto the station. He was a tall, floating creature with 3 eyes and a clipboard that hovered beside him. He did not smile. He did not shake hands. He simply said, "Show me." Xylar led him through the corridors, walking slowly, trying to delay the inevitable doom. They passed the cafeteria. The automatic door, the one Sarah had kicked, slid open with incredible speed. It was faster than any other door on the ship. The inspector stopped. He looked at the dent in the metal panel where Sarah's boot had hit. Xylar closed his eyes, waiting for the scream of rage. Instead, the inspector hummed. He noted that the door's reaction time was 0.5 seconds faster than the factory standard. He made a green checkmark on his clipboard. They moved to the hydroponics bay. This was the moment Xylar feared the most. The giant silver ball of duct tape was still wrapped around the main water pipe. It looked like a giant, shiny tumor growing out of the wall. It was ugly and lumpy. Xylar began to apologize immediately. He started to explain that they were waiting for proper parts from the homeworld. But the inspector held up a hand to silence him. The inspector walked around the tape ball. He tapped it with a long finger. He looked at the moisture sensors. The humidity in the room was perfect. The leak was completely sealed. The inspector asked what this miraculous silver material was. Xylar, not wanting to admit it was cheap adhesive tape, panicked and invented a name. He called it multi-layered flex webbing. The inspector looked impressed. He noted that it was far more durable than the standard crystal alloy pipes. Another green checkmark appeared. Finally, they went to the power core control room. The inspector looked at the energy output screens. His 3 eyes went wide. The station was running at 140% efficiency. The power flow was smoother and stronger than any station in the sector. The inspector demanded to see the modification that allowed this power boost. Xylar quietly pulled up the external camera feed. On the large screen, the image of the scorched outer hull appeared. There, stuck firmly between the 2 power cables, was the rusty iron wrench. It was glowing slightly red from the heat, but it held the connection perfectly. Xylar prepared his resignation speech. He was ready to beg for mercy. But the inspector did not look angry. He looked amazed. He turned to Xylar with a look of pure respect. He spoke about the brilliance of using solid iron for high-voltage conduction. He praised Xylar's bold decision to bypass the fragile fuses. He called it a masterpiece of direct kinetic engineering. He claimed that Xylar was a visionary who was not afraid to break the rules to improve efficiency. The inspector stamped the clipboard with a golden seal of excellence. He promised to recommend Xylar for a promotion and to send engineers from other stations to study these advanced techniques. The inspector left an hour later, praising the station as the best in the fleet. Xylar stood alone in the docking bay, feeling lightheaded. He had survived. He had actually been promoted because of the humans' chaotic repairs. He walked slowly to the break room to tell Dave and Sarah the news. He found them sitting at a table, taking apart the station's only food synthesizer. There were springs and screws covering the floor. Dave was holding a hammer, and Sarah was pouring glue into a gear mechanism. They looked up and smiled at Xylar. Dave asked if the fancy alien guy had liked the tour. Xylar looked at the hammer, the glue, and the mess. He sighed a long, deep sigh, and for the first time in his life, he picked up a roll of duct tape. He handed it to Dave and simply said, "Carry on."